Namaste. This is Abhinav Prakash and welcome to Urban Chatterati. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, Sanjaya Baru ji, whose recent book on India's power elite is creating lots of conversation, discussion across the country. So welcome, sir, to my show.
Thank you for inviting me, Abhinav. I must confess, I learned a lot listening to your recent recording. You had a very interesting recording in which you, of course, mentioned me also. But I think you and I seem to be on the same page on many issues. And I'm therefore delighted to be here. And I'm delighted that you've read my book. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those kind words. So when we talk about elites in India, the first question arises, what is an elite in any society? And what is an elite in India? Because as Lohiya pointed out, that you have to be an upper caste, you have to be wealthy, and you have to be rich. You have to be English educated, anglicized. So is that definition true, or do we have something more out there?
Well, it's a very succinct definition. In fact, in my book, which I should show, is called, this is the book, The Indian Power Elite. I have an entire chapter devoted to looking at some of the key literature in sociology on the definition of an elite, how various sociologists have over the years looked at the concept of an elite. But I found Ramanohar Lohiya's definition very succinct because it captures three very important dimensions of elitism, if you like, in India. One being caste, the second being class, wealth, and the third being language, which, as I've argued in my book, is a very important element in India, given the duality of our society in terms of the English-speaking and the vernacular Indian. So I think Ramanohar Lohiya's summarizing is very, very interesting. The only difference I have, or rather not difference, but the only way in which I would say that India has moved beyond the India that Ram Manohar Lohiya was writing about. And, his essay was written in 1959. And over the last 60, 70 years, this country has moved on. So therefore, being upper caste is no longer a necessary condition for being the power elite of this country. A lot of the middle castes, the Yadav community, for example, in UP or Bihar, or the Reddis and Kammas in Andhra, a lot of the middle caste, the Patels in Gujarat, many of them are now very, very powerful communities, politically, economically powerful. And secondly, what Ram Manohar Lohiya looks at the wealthy, I think we have to make a distinction now between the old wealthy and the new rich, the new wealthy. Indian politics has enabled a large number of people to become wealthy in the last 50, 60 years, and they're extremely powerful people.
But those may be powerful people, like let's say Mulayam Singh Yadav or Lalu Yadav may be powerful people, but they don't have that cultural capital. They don't have the social capital to run the system in Delhi. In fact, they're treated like countryside bumpkins by the Latins Delhi, so we speak, so, as we call them. So
that's not true. Let me interrupt you on this and say that is actually not true. Because one of the great things about the way in which our democracy has functioned is that the permanent civil service, and that's a new institution in India which you don't have in many of the Western countries. The permanent civil service has been the bridge between this class of politicians who come to power thanks to democracy and the power systems. Incidentally, nobody in Delhi, I recall, saw Mulayam Singh Yadav as a country bumpkin. He was a very, very powerful defense minister, though for a brief period. And he made huge changes in the way in which the defense ministry was functioning. And, or you take even others, going back to an earlier generation, a man like Kamaraj, who couldn't even speak English, who spoke Tamil, but enjoyed enormous power in that period. So, in fact, the point I make in this book is that the way we have to look at power in India is far more complex. And you need to understand the dynamics of power that are attributable to wealth on the one hand, to caste on the other hand, to political power on the other hand. I mean, politics throws up And within one generation they learn. I mean, after all, Mulayam Singh Yadav may have been essentially vernacular in his thinking and articulation, but his son Akhilesh went to Australia, studied in the English medium, has an international degree. So within one generation that changes. And I think that's very important across the country.
But you also point out that there are provincial elites like Akhilesh Yadav and all, and then this national Delhi elite, which dominates the power structures in India. So, what is this Delhi's elite out there, which is often derided by people as Khan Market Gang or Lutyens Delhi and so on? What is its social composition? What is the origin of that national Delhi elite?
Well, first of all, the national elite, as I argue in my book, again, is a very complex structure. I mean, you go back 70 years, the G.D. Birla, J.R.D. Tata, Lala Sriram, the Marwadi businessmen of Calcutta, the big business of Bombay, they were extremely powerful people in terms of their influence on policy. They tried to guide Indian policy making in the 50s. So you have a traditional business class in this country as opposed to a newly emerging business class. And those are when I talk of regional and national, I, in fact, in an earlier work, looked at the way in which regional elites used their political contacts to overcome the handicap that they had vis-a-vis the national big business. So you have big business, which is national. So it's not really, Khan Market Gang is a very narrow concept of a cultural elite. I think that is the group that Prime Minister Modi has kind of targeted because they are culturally important in terms of their influence in the media, influence in the cultural space. But certainly Indian big business is not really in Delhi; it's in Bombay or in Gujarat. For example, Adani today, one of the most powerful businessmen, is based in Gujarat. So the point I make in this book is that all these structures are very complicated. The fact is that Prime Minister Modi has used Lutyens Delhi and Khan Market Gang really as shorthand terms to identify a group that was influential in Delhi and that he did not particularly like. But then the power elite of the country is much wider. I mean, for example, I also identify Bollywood, the influence of very powerful and popular film actors. And they are in Bombay, their base is across the country. So I think what I'm trying to do in the book, I don't know if very successfully, and that I leave it to the readers to decide, is to bring out the complexity of this power elite and make the point that it's not as simple as we think it is, but it's quite a complex structure.
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned Kaleski and how he says that you have an intermediary class out there. We used to read Kaleski in our economics class at JNU, but never read this aspect of Kaleski before this. You also have Barrington Moore, who pointed out once that India is paying the price of a peaceful change, that you never had a revolution. So old elites continued, but there has been no disruption. But because of democracy, there is change on the ground, and it's a very, very violent-prone society. So the price of a peaceful change is that the elites continue to control power, people at the bottom continue to suffer, but this intermediary class has acquired some kind of prominence or social mobility. So how do you explain that process in 21st century?
Well, first of all, I think I'm delighted to speak to someone who has read Kaleski and Barrington Moore. These days you don't come across too many people who are familiar with the writings of these people, because I think they're very, very perceptive analysts of Indian society and Indian polity. And so I'm very happy to be here with you. How do we look at what is happening in the 21st century? I think it's very interesting that one of the points that Kaleski makes is the power of the intermediate classes, and both through the political process, because of the fact that they're in numerical terms very significant, which incidentally is also the point that Ramanohar Lohia made when he talked about the unification of all the backward castes. He said the Brahmins constitute a very small percentage of Indian society, the Kshatriyas constitute a very small percentage of Indian society, but you have a large number of backward castes, very varied across the country, not very clearly identified as backward castes, but when you put them all together, then they have numbers. And then he argues how putting them together, bringing them together under this category, umbrella category called OBC, can have an impact on the power system. And that is precisely what has happened. So that's one change. The second change is that the bureaucracy in India, which remains powerful, I mean, despite all the change and liberalization of the economy, etc., the Indian system, the bureaucracy is an extremely powerful constituent of the power system. And the members of this bureaucracy in the past came mainly from the upper castes. So if you look at the induction into the ICS first and then the IAS in the 1950s, 1960s, and we now have some studies that capture the caste composition of the civil services, they came essentially from the upper caste because they are the ones who had access to good education in the 50s, 60s, etc. But if you look at it now, you see increasingly the middle caste coming into the civil services. Partly also because the upper caste are going into the private sector or they're going abroad. I mean, I come from Telangana, I come from Andhra Pradesh. In my part of India, anyone who's bright goes into engineering or medicine and goes to the US. They don't remain in India, right? So, but therefore they don't write the IAS exam. But in the north, I think it's still very common for a lot of young people to be wanting to be in the civil service. And they all come from middle caste. So the caste bureaucracy remains important, but the caste composition of the bureaucracy has changed. And that again is an important way in which the transition is happening in the 21st century.
But you also, when discussing bureaucracy, you pointed out something very interesting, that all the top positions, let's say in the central bureaucracy at least, are dominated by certain forward castes, and within them, certain people who are related to each other by marriage or by relation. Has anything changed in that?
Yes, that has changed. In fact, that data I present is for the 1970s and 80s. It's now 40 years since then. And that has certainly changed because the specific thing which I refer to where all the senior joint secretaries in important ministries were the sons or sons-in-law of senior secretaries. That particular thing was 1970s, early 70s. But that's no longer the case today. I think now there is certainly change and you have a large number of people in important positions of power who are not children of civil servants, who come from very different social backgrounds. So there is change. I think it's important to recognize in India that the composition of the power elite is changing, has been changing and is changing.
Yes, but when we talk about another aspect, which is culture, whether it's media, academia, or even Bollywood, as you talk about, what has been happening there? Because we see lots of noise is coming from there in the last 5-6 years. And many people say this is the rise of a disenfranchised elite, that you no longer sit in the commission, you are no longer deciding education policy, you are no longer managing the institutions. Is there a cultural war going on in India as of now?
Yeah, well, certainly there is. I think there is certainly a difference in perception, if you like, of those who were in all these institutions in the past and today. But I think it's important to make a distinction between the angst of those who have lost power and their complaint that we no longer matter. That's one way of looking at this. But I think there's also another way of looking at what is happening, which is the changes in the value system. I mean, you take, for example, the recent assault in Bollywood. One of the dimensions of that recent assault was this constant allegation that Muslims have dominated Bollywood, and we now want to have Muslim Mukht Bollywood. Now there's a communal angle to that. It's not just about one class of people being replaced by another class of people, but there's certainly a communal dimension to the attack on the Khans, the Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, and Javed Akhtar. So there is that aspect to the attack. Secondly, in Delhi, in the media, I think it's true that there were a lot of entrenched interests, and a new set of people are coming into the media, and there is that social tension. But there's also an ideological tension. I mean, those who are more secular or plural in their cultural thinking, as opposed to those who are less secular. I mean, so it's a complex set of issues that divide people. I don't think it's unidimensional.
Yeah, but when we talk about especially the institutions of India as of now, and when we talk about academia, there's lots of hue and cry that there is saffronization which is happening. But from personal experience, what I know, I see all kind of people getting appointed everywhere. Even the far left people are getting permanent position in many universities under this government. So there is a counter argument to that, which comes from social justice groups. Say that this is not the real power game or cultural conflict which is happening in India. The real thing is that you have the reservations now in academia, and that is why the caste composition of academia is changing, which is creating all this kind of unrest and chaos. So, for example, in JNU they point out that the left is saying there's a saffronization going on, but all the cases they have pointed out belong to the reserve category seats, on which they have went to the court or they have fought a case. And because those seats were vacant for decades under the left dominance of the Congress rule. Do you think that is also something playing out there? It's not just the elite war, it's something more deeper?
Well, look, that's the point I'm making. I mean, it is not unidimensional. This contention between an old India and a new India, an old elite and a new elite, is not unidimensional. It is multidimensional. And therefore, I think, each of these aspects, there is some truth to it. I don't think you can say there's only one way of looking at it, and there's only one truth. There are multiple truths. There is a conflict of caste, there's a conflict of class, there's a conflict of the metropolitan versus the vernacular, the globalized versus the Indian. I mean, for example, one of the criticisms of private universities in India, the new private universities, is that most of them are people with a PhD from abroad. And that, it's very difficult if you have an Indian PhD to get jobs there. So, that is again coming up as an issue. So I think, we are living through a period of multiple contentions. And that's all the point I'm making, is to understand the many-sidedness of this.
Yes. And you say that before Prime Minister Modi, everyone who came to Delhi, whether it's Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, they tried to be good with the old elite of Delhi, or they tried to become part of it. Narasimha Rao was a great scholar, but he was never accepted by the Delhi elite because he was a vernacular intellectual, as you say. What has Modi done that you have this kind of disruption which is happening? Because, as you say, they never expected this to happen.
Yes, you see, I mean, this all depends on the way in which political leaders have defined themselves. Narasimha Rao was not just vernacular, he was very articulate in many languages. His knowledge of English was as good as Telugu, his knowledge of Urdu was as good as Hindi, his knowledge of Sanskrit was as good as Spanish. He was a polylinguist, right? So it's very difficult to categorize him as a vernacular.
But he did not have that Oxbridge credentials.
That is true, but he didn't need it. He had more academic qualifications than an Oxbridge guy. But the fact is that he was the first South Indian Prime Minister. The reason he felt like an outsider in Delhi was not because he was handicapped by language. The reason he felt as an outsider was because he was India's first South Indian Prime Minister. And in fact, the only South Indian Prime Minister for a full term. Deve Gowda was there only for a year. And Delhi was very much a Hindi city. I remember even with Dr. Manmohan Singh, when his first Independence Day speech we had to write in August 2004, he was told he has to speak in Hindi because it was the culture and convention in India that the Prime Minister's address on Independence Day has to be in Hindi. Fortunately, Narasimha Rao knew very good Hindi, so that was not a problem for him. But what Manmohan Singh could read Gurmukhi, and he could read Urdu because he was educated. He was medium of instruction was Urdu and Gurmukhi. So we used to actually have his speeches written in Urdu or in Gurmukhi, but using Hindi words. So, he would give a Hindi speech, as he did for every year at the Red Fort, but the actual text was typed either in Urdu script or in Gurmukhi script. Um, Now, this is the kind of thing, you see, what Delhi has came to represent. And so, to come back to your question, I think other prime ministers accepted the norms of Delhi, accepted who the powerful were in Delhi. In the media, for example, they accepted that these are the individuals who dominate media. I think Narendra Modi was the first person who came and said, "I'm not going to accept this. I will move them aside, and I'll only deal with people I like. I will not deal with people I do not like." And that was a very different, way of dealing with this. Now, in the long run, whether it works or not, let us wait and see how the elite respond to all this over a period of time.
But if you read Professor Dipankar Gupta's book, The Revolution from Above, he says that elite play a very important role in shaping the direction of a country. So if the old elites are being replaced, let's say being removed from their position of privilege, the process is unfolding as of now. So we can't say that they have been removed already. Who are the new elites which are emerging? Can we see them on the horizon?
Yeah, I've tried to grapple with that. For example, I draw attention to the beneficiaries of the Green Revolution across the country, and particularly in states where there was a Green Revolution, the rich farmer class, and how important they are politically and economically, whether it's the Jat farmers of Punjab or the Reddy and Kamma farmers of Andhra Pradesh, the Chettiars in Tamil Nadu, the Gaundars. Across the country, you have the beneficiaries of the Green Revolution are one community that were not that powerful in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even early 80s, but today constitute across the country a very powerful section of society. Similarly, the new businesses, the what I call regional business. I mean, if you look at the contention between the Bombay-based Tata, Birla, Ambani, and then the Bangalore-based business groups, Hyderabad-based business groups, or even Punjab-based business groups, you can see in every market, in every industry, this tension between the new business groups and the old business groups. In fact, I make the point in my book that if you take the top 100 businessmen in India in 1990 and 2000, you see a dramatic change. The 90s were a decade of dramatic change. You didn't see that kind of change before the 90s, and you don't actually see that much of a change after the 2000s. But the 90s, thanks to liberalization in 91 and the end of the license permit Raj, saw a dramatic change in the composition of the top 100 business groups in the country. So that kind of change is happening, and those are the new groups that are coming up.
So you're basically saying that there's a new class which has emerged after economic reforms in this country. So is this new class which now has wealth, which might also have political power, but they don't have the commanding heights as of now. So they don't have cultural capital, social capital, or the educational capital to control the policy of the country like the national elites do. Do you think that is also playing out somewhere in this disruption?
No, that is already playing out. I mean, I don't think it's any longer true to say that they don't have cultural capital. They've acquired the cultural capital. Many of them have gone abroad and acquired qualifications internationally. And therefore, you see the transition, particularly in the more developed states. I mean, Gujarat, for example, is a good example of a state in which the Gujarati-speaking businessman today dominates the scene. He's not even English-speaking. Most businessmen in Gujarat who are millionaires and billionaires, operate in their vernacular. The same is true in Tamil Nadu. So you actually have now in many developed states elite that has also acquired cultural capital apart from economic capital.
So you're saying this is, yeah.
So go ahead.
You are saying basically this is the struggle between the elites, and culture is an aspect of that struggle between
That's
old elites and the new elites.
That's right. That's right.
So, would you classify RSS as the new power center in the realm of social and cultural elites?
Yes, I mean, after all, they are very, very central to the current power structure. Since the BJP is a creation of the RSS, the Jansangh first and BJP, they are all creations of the RSS. The party is the mother organization. But I also draw attention to the fact that the RSS traditionally was a Brahmin-dominated organization, and we now find that also is changing. I mean, Prime Minister Modi is not a Brahmin, and in many ways probably has now acquired more power as Prime Minister than the RSS chief. So I think those balances are also being disturbed. But certainly the RSS is a very, very influential organization, and it has political power, it has cultural power, and sometimes you also see that it has acquired economic power. I mean, when Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani find it necessary to travel to Nagpur and pay a courtesy call on the head of the RSS, then you know that it's an organization that also has economic power.
So, when you talk about RSS and its expansion countrywide, you have pointed out its social character is also changing. Are we seeing a new common sense in India, as Professor Badri Narayan calls in a new book, The Republic of Hindutva? Might that be the second Republic of India, where you have completely different set of elites in the place of the old Nehruvian elites?
See, the problem there, I'll tell you, is very simple. It all depends on how you interpret Hindutva. I had a very interesting conversation with the head of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat ji, when he came to Delhi 3 years back. He gave a series of lectures at the Vigyan Bhavan. I attended those lectures, and I had the opportunity to have a conversation with him. And I said to him, look, you are interpreting the word Hindutva actually in secular terms by saying that Hindutva includes everybody, that anyone whose ancestor is a Hindu, after all, whether it's Christian or Muslim today, is a Hindu. So I said, my constitution begins with the line, India, that is Bharat. So since my constitution says India, that is Bharat, why don't you say Bharatiyata as the defining feature of every Indian rather than Hindutva? Because no Christian or Muslim or Sikh or anybody can object to the concept of Bharatiyata. And the BJP itself calls itself Bharatiya Janata Party. It doesn't call itself Hindutva Janata Party, right? So Bharatiyata is a secular concept because it is a constitutional concept. And this is very important for us to understand in India, that we are a plural society. And any politics, particularly politics of the ruling elite, has to be inclusive. And that's where I draw a distinction between the way in which Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee conceptualized Hindutva and the way in which it is being done now. Because Vajpayee ji had a far more inclusive way of looking at Hindutva. I mean, today we have a Union Council of Ministers where the only Muslim deals with minority affairs. You don't have any Muslim in any other ministry. This is not a representative government. It's a government of the majority. And I think that's what worries me. When you say Republic of Hindutva, Republic of India is a Republic of Bharat. Why you want to call it Hindutva and reduce its scope? You are reducing its scope and making it an exclusionary concept. What legitimacy, what role are we giving to the non-Hindus in this republic? Because the constitution gives them a role. The constitution treats all religions equally. It's written in the constitution. So you cannot reinterpret the constitution to privilege one community or another. That's the way I would look at it.
But when we talk about Prime Minister's electoral victories, he has deployed this anti-elite language and sentiment in mobilizing the people. The question is, why did the people respond to that? Before him also many politicians have tried to do that, but not as successfully as he did it. Is it because of the old elites, or less than Delhi elites specifically, they had become the symbol of hatred, or maybe people stopped disliking them? What happened in the last 10-15 years that the situation entirely changed, when people used to look up to these public intellectuals, policy intellectuals, media people, or cultural icons, to this point when we call Bollywood as Urdu wood and so on?
You see, first of all, I don't accept the view that anti-elitism is the only plank of the BJP under Modi. In fact, my argument is that Prime Minister Modi has occupied all platforms. He has occupied the left platform. His economic policy on many issues is very similar to the left. It's only in his seventh year, that too because of a crisis, that we are talking about nationalization of public sector banks, privatization of public sector banks, and that too in a limited way. I mean, there are many aspects of the Congress economic policy that the BJP has been very comfortable with. Trade policy, increasing protection to Indian industry, that kind of stuff. So, in many ways, the Prime Minister Modi has occupied the left platform. He has occupied the Mandal platform. As I've said in the book, I mean, the whole politics of Bihar and UP of Mandal versus Masjid was, in fact, one against the other. And that is how, during VP Singh's time, the issues about OBCs, etc., was brought up in order to deal with the rising presence of the BJP in northern India. What has Prime Minister Modi done? He has taken on the Mandal platform. So he says, I'm an OBC. I'm an OBC leader. So he has taken the left platform, he's taken the Mandal platform, he's taken the Congress platform. He talks about non-alignment now, or multi-alignment. So even foreign policy is very similar to the foreign policy of Dr. Manmohan Singh. But there's very little difference. So I think what he has done, and that is the interesting thing about Prime Minister Modi, is not that he has taken an ideologically extremist position or a purist position and challenging something. He has actually taken a much more pluralistic position on many issues and trying to occupy the platform of his rivals. How long this phase will last, we don't know. But right now, that's the phase where the BJP is trying to project itself like the Congress of the 50s, an umbrella party, all things to all people. And the only communities that feel aggrieved even today, despite all of this, actually happen to be the minorities, the Muslims and the Christians. So if you exclude that one thing, in fact, I've said many times that if apart from the whole issue of secularism and the role of minorities, there's very little difference between the economic ideology of the BJP and the economic ideology of the Congress or even the left. After all, most successful programs of Prime Minister Modi were started by Dr. Manmohan Singh. Make in India, Swachh Bharat, Narega, Rural Health Mission, Urban Renewal, all these programs started during UPA. He has continued all of them. He has not scrapped any program. So there is a much greater continuity than change.
That's an interesting point. Many people would disagree with that, but that's one way to look at it. But let's say when you're talking about the Mandal politics, you have rightly pointed out that BJP has outcompeted the caste politics, the Mandal politics. The BJP has outflanked the left, and now in Bengal we're seeing the rise of what is being called subaltern Hindutva. Do you think that going forward, will we see more democratization of the elite space in this country, political, cultural, economic elite, or will we say more concentration, simply a replacement of the old by the new?
Well, I think it's difficult to forecast, but I certainly think what will determine all of this is the success of this government on the economic front. Because the bottom line for all of us, I mean, I may be Hindu, I may be Muslim, I may be Reddy, I may be Brahmin, I may be Kayast, I may be whatever. If my children don't get jobs, if I don't get adequate sustenance, If the economy is not growing, for me, survival becomes the issue. And we are still, we should never forget, we are still a poor developing country. We are a low income developing country. Almost a third of our population still lives in poverty. Poverty has come down from 50% of the total population to probably around 20% of the total population. And in the last year, because of COVID, etc., many economists say it's gone up. Whatever it is, there's a large number of Indians who still live in lives that are not acceptable in the 21st century. So priority has to be the economy. If the economy does well, and if we see employment opportunities growing, educational opportunities growing, healthcare improving, and people are happy, then of course this project will succeed. But if that does not happen, then you can't go, just you can't go to a hungry person and say, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to feed you, but I built a new temple. Come, we can all pray there. That's not going to work. That's not going to work.
That's a fair point. In fact, I have also argued that socioeconomic mobility for the masses is the most critical part of the success of the Hindutva project. If they fail to deliver, then it's going to unravel, because it's much more easier to build a coalition of Hindu castes than to maintain it. But before you go, sir, a final question to you. When I was tweeting some points from your book, someone, I'll not name the person, he called you Mir Zafar of the Lutyens Delhi. And he mentioned your
First of all,
accidental prime minister book. So how do you see, are you part of the old elite or the new, or you are somewhere in between?
You see, first of all, I don't react to all the nonsense on Twitter. I have been on Twitter to promote my writing, my columns, my books. And once I've stopped writing, I will be off Twitter. Twitter is full of a lot of anonymous people who don't have the courage to put their own name and put out ideas without having the courage to actually own up those ideas. So I don't want to react to that. But how do I see myself? I see myself as a writer. I mean, I remember many years ago when I became a journalist, Sameer Jain, who was the owner of the Times of India and the vice chairman of the company, said to me, he said, Dr. Baru, your mother must have known you're going to become a journalist. I said, why? Because she named you Sanjaya. And Sanjaya is the narrator of the Mahabharata. So I said to him, yes, I mean, I see myself as a narrator. I am the Sanjaya of Lutyens Delhi, if you like, or the non-Lutyens Delhi. I write, I see what is happening on this Kurukshetra of politics. And I write. And it's up to you. You want to read, you read. If you don't want to read, don't read. But, this kind of name calling is stupid, immature, and gutless. I mean, people who do all this don't have the courage to put their own name there. Thank you very much.
Anyway, sir, thanks a lot. And thank you for coming to a non-elite channel. And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And also you can join as a member if you'd like. See you soon.
No, I came to your program because I liked hearing what you say. I will now start also reading what you say. I think you're saying some very interesting things. So I
thank you,
wish you all the best.
Thanks.